Hey gang, this week we are in Orlando, Florida, and we are sitting down with owner of The Jungle Mixed Martial Arts, Mike Lee. I've known Mike Lee pretty much since the start of being a gym owner. When I first started out, I decided I needed to go find somebody in the sport who knew what they were doing, had been in the sport, was a veteran, and the name I ran into again and again was Mike Lee. So I put my stuff in my car and drove my little self to Orlando and walked in, introduced myself, and they were nothing but welcoming and cool to me, and Mike has been someone I call for advice ever since. Mike has an extremely extensive background and has many great stories, so I hope you enjoy the episode, and we'll see you in just a few seconds. Hello, everybody, and welcome once again to the Under the Cage podcast. I am your host, Coach Sky Rudlow, and today we are joined by Jungle owner Mike Lee. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
All right. It's been an awesome looking place. You guys are always making improvements. I love coming in, visiting you guys here. We are in Orlando, Florida. Should clarify that part. But anywho, so Mike, what I like to start these things out with, just so people kind of who are unfamiliar with your background and career, tell us a little bit about how you got started in this stuff, where your beginnings were, your career as a fighter, and then from there, we'll just kind of go on from there.
Sounds good. Pretty old. I'm going to date myself here, but I saw UFC 1 with my dad.
Nice.
Saw it on pay-per-view at a friend's house with him. I was blown away by it. And at the end of UFC, you could buy VHS videotapes to learn how to fight like the Gracies.
Right.
So I bought those tapes and started wrestling in my backyard with friends. After about a year or two, we actually found a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We were blown away in the 90s that we actually found a real practitioner of Jiu-Jitsu. Met up with him, met up with his coach, and kind of the rest were history.
Was that here in the Orlando area?
That was originally.
Okay, yeah.
We went to school up in Gainesville, started going to UF and the community college up there with a lot of other friends who were training jiu-jitsu at the time. We started wrestling in our own apartment and started out with a fight team, so to speak, in the late 90s in the middle of Gainesville, Florida, where we had people go to IVC in Brazil with the bare knuckle stuff, over to Japan, eventually to the UFC, kind of fighting out of a matted out apartment until we could afford to open our first school in probably 1998. Eventually made friends, made a lot of good teammates, and where I met my current business partner, Seth Petruzelli, he beat one of our undefeated heavyweights in probably 2000. We became, or 1999, 2000 era. We became great friends afterwards. Started traveling with him for his fights, cross-training with each other. And then fast forward to about 2008, we'd always dreamt about opening up a school together. And Seth reached out and said, Mike, let's do it. It's now or never. And he had this amazing location, amazing idea how to run everything to get going. So we dropped everything, moved up here, and we made it work. And that was about 16 years ago.
Nice. So before the jungle existed and all that, you say you were just starting out. Who were your first coaches back then? Where did you, eventually I'm assuming you went past blue belt coaches and all that. You're a high level black belt now. So
first coaches, were definitely the VHS tapes.
Right.
We were, I think a lot of people in the 90s, early thousands, even the UFCs included, weren't training at gyms. They were training with other friends, people who were varsity wrestlers, people who had some boxing or kickboxing, people who just did traditional martial arts, and other crazy people enough to start practicing this in gyms and schools, where I think without a official coach, and as a few of us developed as the team leaders, we were probably fighting for 5 or 6 years without an official coach before we realized it was time to actually make something out of this.
Right.
That it was more than just a fight club, and it actually was growing into a sport that it is today.
It was such a primitive, well, that's not the right word, but it was a very early phases of it in the country. It was a very primitive part of the sport. It was the early days of the sport. Where were you finding fights back then? Because, it wasn't like, you can go to any town in America now and you're within 50 miles of the fight nowadays. But I know, and I started way after you, but well, not way after you, but I started after you, and it was hard to find them then. And that was as it was starting to explode. You were there really before the sport exploded, before the Ultimate Fighter, before all that.
Yeah.
So, how are you finding fights back then?
It was really a lot of phone calls. I'm, again, pretty old and going to date myself, but phone calls used to be free after 9 p.m. on your cell phone. So you couldn't make long distance calls during the day. So at 9 p.m., we would literally call these people across America that through like the beginning of the internet, people were finding on forums, and which would be like Reddit nowadays. People were going on websites saying, if you want to fight, come here. And we would call up these matchmakers, these promoters around the country and pay for ourselves because you didn't make any money back then. But we would drive cross country for $100. We would fight here in Orlando for $0.
Right.
And the rules were pretty rough back then. Sometimes there was headbutts, sometimes there wasn't. Sometimes there was elbows, sometimes it wasn't. Weight classes were pretty few and far between. They said, you two guys look kind of close. You fight.
Yeah.
Oh, he dropped out. You fight him, or you fight him. So it wasn't really the glory of it nowadays. Nobody did it to be rich. It was just a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We used to think as a young kid, this was like pretty up there with being a rock star. You're in front of a crowd. People are cheering for you. You feel the adrenaline. You feel the amazing win and how good you felt afterwards. And for me, it was a good way just to travel. Right. I really got to travel with a group of friends and buddies across the world at this point that had great experiences and good stories I could tell my kids at the early days before there was any money of it. The Ultimate Fighter changed everything. It really did. It brought everything from underground fight clubs. Even when the UFC was pretty established, most people would just stare you up and down if you told them you're a fighter. The Ultimate Fighter made it socially acceptable almost. It became real. People said, wow, that's the stuff you do. Instead of, ugh, that's the stuff you do.
Or they thought you were a boxer or something like that.
And trying to describe what MMA was before that was next to impossible. So yeah, the Ultimate Fighter, when you brought that up, that changed everything, more so than the UFC itself, I would say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for sure, it brought the UFC up front.
It did, to the masses.
People understood what it was then, That was pretty close to when I got into it. I'd been in it a short period when that show happened, so I didn't really get to experience the true Wild West of it. You
didn't miss much.
Yeah. Everyone's got good stories from there.
A lot of good stories.
Yeah, a lot of crazy stuff like that. When Florida kind of turned into the mecca of MMA for a long time, still really is one of the big hubs. I would say kind of here, Colorado and California are the major hubs for it. But at that time, it really wasn't. I would say the original hubs were more West Coast because that's where the Gracie stuff was to begin with. What were the first signs that you saw it starting to make its way over here?
I would say we had friends in Miami that would come up to Orlando. They would pick us up in Gainesville when we would travel. And we kind of called it like the Florida fight team for a bit. But I think just the weather in general, people enjoy a lot of Brazilians who are coming up here. Miami had a big school to start out with it too. I had a lot of Brazilian friends that I made from South Florida that were training down there at different jiu-jitsu schools. Orlando had one of the first jiu-jitsu schools and jiu-jitsu scenes, I think, like in the Southeast, everywhere. There was probably like 2 big academies back then. They started training with it. And then we didn't have the wrestling that a lot of the West Coast did. Now a lot's changed over the years, but we had more like one of the first jiu-jitsu bases in Florida. So I think that, especially in the old days, that kind of made more of an impact than the other stuff. We had some just luck of the draw, great athletes that started out in Florida that kind of rose up, and people would try to emulate them, how they were starting to train, how you had to do more than just jiu-jitsu to start fighting. You had to learn to strike. You had to learn to wrestle. There was a lot of sports in Florida, I think in the 90s and early 2000s. So I think just that sports scenes in general brought the MMA scenes. There were similar fans. I remember fighting down in Hialeah, and people had packed the house to watch boxing for 50 years down there. So when they put in the MMA, people were probably expecting boxing, but they still came in, saw the boxing ring, and saw people fighting in there. The crowd took off. And a lot of future UFC stars came out from that South Florida scene, from the Central Florida scene, and came into it. When it first started making like a living on it too, I remember being in corners of these world champions, people who were still winning the biggest shows at the time, but then they still had 3 jobs to make ends meet. And for a short while, we just said, this is amazing sport, it's fun, but we'll never be able to make a living off of this. You'll never be able to do anything. Slowly but surely, people's pay started going up. People started opening up their own gyms. People started doing like selling merchandise, little things to make the ends meet, where a career started becoming like viable for the sport that didn't exist 20 years ago. And that was a very long, slow process, I would say.
Yeah, it was kind of a hiccup and all that when they changed the sponsorships at the UFC too, because then suddenly half of people's little side hustles
as much as it was
gone.
So I'll argue with that. Half the people did go on. The other half of people were happy for it.
Really?
I remember many times, if I would sponsor you for 5 or 10 grand, I didn't actually give you the money. I promised to give it to you after the fight. And people that talked about making 10 grand never saw a penny come to that. And I could probably show you some old banners with broken promises. So we had people fight in the biggest shows in the world on pay-per-view, go home, try to collect that money from that sponsor. And the sponsor said, sorry, we didn't make anything. We can't pay you. So
like legal contracts would get involved. If
there was a lot of legal contracts, but how do you squeeze that out of somebody with no money?
Yeah.
And if you go back, watch an old YouTube video, watch old banners of the UFC. Tell me if you know one of the companies on there, or if you ever bought one thing from one of those banners.
Condom Depot. No,
besides Condom Depot, but did you ever buy anything off of that too? So
no,
a lot of those, when you did try to get your sponsorship money, including Condom Depot, did ripple off a lot of people.
Really?
Yeah.
I'd like to say that surprises me, but it is a company that demanded that the logo of Condom Depot went over everyone's butt. So
right.
I'd like to say that's a little more shocking.
So a lot of the people that loved hating on Reebok just didn't necessarily go through. Now, there were some people that made a lot of money. They were better businessmen. But the average Joe really didn't make that much money on sponsorship more than one time. Yeah. Because if you did get paid, people didn't pay you the second time.
Yeah.
So
I know Anderson took a pretty big hit.
Yeah, for sure. And people like that did. And so it was, like I said, the top tier people did take a big hit. Yeah. But the average UFC fighter, I'll argue, like, you can go back and I don't think they made that much money on it.
Yeah. I mean, you would know. You were kind of there for those early UFC fights.
Yeah, I remember the difference of some early UFC fights with my business partner, Seth. Being in his corner before the Ultimate Fighter, we're doing different things and just going out there watching UFCs before, traveling around the country and watching them. And then the level of, like, just a professional level of what they are today, of how you go there, of how they have this ironclad schedule when you show up. They have it down to a science of how to make the show run. And it's amazing. They've really come out, they legitimized everything. It used to be kind of a free-for-all. If you look at old videos, there were after parties at UFCs where there's always fights breaking out and there was this or that. So a lot of that nowadays, it's professionalism. You hear about the same amount of stuff as you do at the NFL, as you do NBA. So there's always going to be hiccups. There's always going to be the bad seeds. There's always going to be a little bit of trouble. But at least it's an event now. It did used to look like some backyard brawls a few times. If you look at old UFCs, the walkway was this big, and they would just cut back and forth to make it look bigger. Yeah. But people were getting burnt on fireworks. People were getting this or that. They would have a hard time getting judges. Judges weren't qualified.
Well,
still, maybe
you can make an argument that that's still going down.
That's a whole different interview one day. A lot of judges, we're still in probably the second generation of MMA. There's not an in-depth, and back then it was the first generation. So judges were local tough guys or karate masters or boxers that had no idea how to score. We still run into that. Yeah. They had to score MMA, Muay Thai, boxing, or whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah, I found the boxing judges were still are the biggest bane of my existence at the amateur level with my students and stuff. Like, you can always recognize the old boxing judge, and it's like, throw all your grappling out the window because that guy's going to score it against you. So that's still an issue for sure. So, but I would agree that it has gotten better since the early days, especially on the regional scene.
The regional scenes. I mean, the regional shows nowadays are bigger and better probably than the UFCs 20 years ago. Yeah. Better put together.
Well, there also are veterans now to be judges. Back then there were no veterans.
Those of us coaching now have that experience. 20 years ago, there was no MMA coaches in America.
Exactly.
There was no MMA. And so when somebody tells you, I did that stuff 50 years ago, no, they didn't. Full contact karate is not MMA. No, it's just not. And
old pancrase.
That's right. And it's not the same.
Open palm.
So it's better coaches now.
Who was the first person out of your crew? Because I know, like, you, Seth, Tom Lawlor, a lot of those guys were in the area here. Who was the first one that you guys took to the UFC that you went with and that sort of thing?
I would guess, like, out of here, I mean, we did have a lot of people when we first opened up that were into UFC. They got onto the Ultimate Fighter. Tom and Seth did real well with that. Felicia Spencer is out of here. Yeah, I've known Felicia since she was about 12 years old. When I met her, she was like a up-and-comer superstar Taekwondo girl. And she was always amazing. She won all the Jiu-Jitsu scenes as she came up to the ranks. There wasn't a lot of women's Jiu-Jitsu, much less women's MMA back then. She was winning all the men's divisions. It's like blue and purple belts back then too. As she moved to go to college and she started training at the Jungle in the early, mid-2000s, she worked her way up through the amateur ranks and into the pros and into fighting for the belt in the UFC during lockdowns of all times. And that was a wild time during lockdowns. But Felicia actually had a real hard time off the bat finding women to fight for the amateur level. Because if you Googled her, you found this purple belt at the time who had won 1,000 jiu-jitsu matches, including men and females. A lot of people didn't want to fight her. She had to go to Vegas to get some amateur fights to get the Invicta contract, where she worked her way up through Invicta to win their belt and then get into the UFC. So Felicia was kind of homegrown from Florida and the area, but she was a superstar for a bit, and now she's happily retired. She still comes in, helps us coach, trains all the time, but she's still in love with the sport and in amazing shape.
Yeah.
But, she's just very happy with life now. Her and her husband are doing very well. They've been a big part of the jungle, since we've opened up. So we've been real lucky to have her.
Felicia, I've gotten the privilege of rolling with her a few times. She is super, super strong, very talented, very technical.
People say it all the time, how nice people are. Felicia really is the nicest human being ever to come through this, and one of the strongest, most powerful, meanest people you can roll with, too.
Yeah.
So, but she just genuinely loves it. She was, very gifted at an early age, and she's a book of knowledge. She coaches people now. She helps people warm up for their fights, but she's also a student. She still to this day as a black belt will come in, watch every class, ask questions with it, put herself in weird situations training where she gets tapped out and has no ego still. And that's how she was doing it for the fights too.
Yeah, funny story, Felicia. So when I first opened up my gym, this was one of the first places I came, and you guys were super welcoming and nice, and thank you for that. Absolutely.
Of course.
And you guys have always been really cool for me coming in since then. But, when I was trying to learn how to run a school, I was like, these guys have been around. They've done it. They've been to the big shows. I'm going to come talk to them. But I got to roll with Felicia a few times, and there were, for whatever reason, a lot of Brazilian students here at the time. And I rolled with her, and I'd said a few things, and I just kind of gotten single syllable answers and stuff. So for like my first 4 visits, I don't know why, I just had it in my head that she was Brazilian and didn't speak English very well, because I'd say like, "Hi, Felicia," and I go, and walk away. And then I saw her interview for the UFC, and she's like, "Hi, I'm Felicia Spencer. I'm from Florida." I was just wait, what?
Our French, Canadian, American, Brazilian Felicia. She's just very soft spoken.
Yeah.
If you had ever asked her an in-depth question, I'm sure she would have talked your ear off like normal.
Yeah.
But Felicia's just very soft.
Well, no, over the years I've had conversations. She's a very great person. I like her a lot.
Yeah, her training, Felicia, was different than everyday Felicia also, like a lot of people.
Yeah.
But she was also the same one that would be the last one to leave and was signing autographs for people around. She still gets fan mail here to the gym. Mm-hmm. So she returns every fan mail and does everything. She was always at every UFC, be the last one to leave to sign kids and fans pictures and shaking hands and doing everything too. So, but on an average day, Felicia's just very chill. And that's why we loved her. She's great with that.
So how did cornering and stuff at the UFC differ from the Seth days on? Because the UFC changed so much from the time,
for sure,
Seth was there and Tom was there to the time Felicia was there. I mean, the women's division came into being and then blew up and got bigger and bigger as she got there. It didn't even exist back in those days. What did you see as a difference?
Besides obvious difference, the uniforms and whatnot too. It was, I would say, just like that professionalism aspect. It was almost a local show vibe. You would get to the venue 8 hours before, and then you would just wait until it was your time to fight, and then you would stay there until midnight, and then you would go back to the hotel. Where now, even the UFC, they have time schedules. What time, if you're fighting at the 8th number and I'm fighting on the 1st, you get there at a different time than me. They want you to come there, wrap your hands, warm up, fight, and go home, back to the hotel. They don't need you there for 8 hours, hanging out the entire time.
So delightful.
So it very is. Before she fought Cyborg, went the distance and bloodied up Cyborg, we were sitting in a hotel room watching comedies and laughing 1 hour before she was wrapping her hands and walked into the cage, fights, and went back home. So instead of that dread of all the local shows, when we need you here at 11 a.m., fights start at 7 p.m.
Yeah.
Why? Just because. So I think the professionalism, the way that they have a schedule is just good. They have a very itemized report. They can give you the itinerary 2 weeks out to know exactly what fight week is going to be. Where they will say, this is the days for the interviews. These are the days for this. This is your nutritionist if you need help. If you need any alterations to your gear, this is. For Felicia in particular, this is when you're going to get your hair done. So I think they just have the system down better. A few years ago, they still didn't have a system. They said, let's put on the fights. You all show up, you all fight, and you all take off. Now they have they have a fight every weekend. They have to be more efficient.
Yeah.
But as a business in general, just having your policies and procedures, like your ducks in a row, is a lot better than shooting from the hip.
Yeah. Psychologically, that seems like it'd be better for a fighter. I never liked that when I used to fight, and I still don't like it now when
I don't like it.
when you're in a losing locker room, and that's bad for your fighter to see all the people coming back after loss after loss after loss, and it's just not good. So it's good to hear that they're doing that.
I remember that for one of Tom's fights. I think he was fighting in D.C. probably, in Washington, D.C. Somebody lost their UFC debut, and they came in the back and they were crying and sobbing, and it wouldn't leave. They cried and sobbed. I shouldn't laugh. They cried and sobbed for 2 hours in the shower, in the locker room, on the benches, as we were moving around, doing everything we could.
Freaking awkward.
And then wrapping up, and he stayed there the entire night. That was a very awkward thing that I don't miss. Where now, I mean, God forbid that would happen, you would also be out of there within 20 minutes or go into another room.
Yeah. I'd love to say I handled every loss,
of course,
professionally, but I had mine. But I never did it for the entirety of the night. So I guess I got
different people.
Yeah.
Different backstories.
Taking an L always sucks. So here's a question. So this is kind of backtracking a little bit, but you fought for a long time. You had a pretty extensive record. Were you coaching throughout all that, or did you just kind of decide at one point, I'm tired of fighting, I want to start coaching?
I had my first fight, I think an open hand fight in 1996, before moving into like the full blown MMA. Really just did it for fun. I was never a super tough kid. I got in my share of fights, but nothing I would call myself like a bully or a fighter.
Yeah.
I just enjoyed it. After watching that UFC 1, I was really blown away by it. It was something I'd never seen, nobody else had ever seen. Fell in love with it and bought every video I could of international MMA and tried to learn. Probably had like 40 times, some odd times inside of a cage or a ring, different rule sets. If you call some other rule sets, maybe like 50 fights. They were just all over. It was like a dream come true. I literally got to travel the world, all over America and around the world to do what I loved, for free, almost a fight trip. If you weren't making a penny, it was a free trip.
Yeah.
And then I got to sightsee. I got to go places that I never thought I would. Towards the end of my career, my very last fights, I had an epiphany, and I tell the story all the time. I won my last fights in about a minute with a head kick. It was ice cold head kick. It was the most epic thing. It was here in Orlando. I think the gym had just opened. We had close to 1,000 people there, like friends, family members cheering. It should have been the most epic win of my life, and it probably was. But as I put my hands up, I had this mental breakthrough. I had more fun last week, and I enjoyed it more when my amateur fighter won his fight than I am right now. And I still had a good time that night. I still celebrated and hammed it up. But having that emotional response, something clicked where I knew my fighting days are over. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't take off my gloves or do anything epic. I didn't make a post or anything. I just said, I'm not going to fight anymore. It was a good way to end my career. Head kick, knockout, I'm out.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with coaching more than I already had. But from my very first fight, I enjoyed giving a helping hand with people. So I'd always coached since my fighting career. But with that breakthrough moment that it came out of nowhere, I had more fun last week at an amateur fight than I do right now in my pro main event here in my hometown. I shouldn't be doing this anymore. And we tell our fighters, if you're not 100% invested into it, don't do it. You can train as much as you want. You can make this part of your life forever. You don't have to fight. If you're fighting, that's almost a marriage. You have to be married to it. You have to make all the other sacrifices. If this isn't 100% what you want to do, you could really be hurt.
Oh, yeah.
Don't do this. And we give that advice still to that day. I took my own advice. I said, I'm not 100% invested in fighting. All my passion is the coaching and running the gyms. So
yeah, it's weird how especially amateurs and stuff will get these things where they'll take fights because they feel like they're obligated or something because they've done one before and they feel like
identity sometimes.
Yeah.
Some people think like, I have to fight. Well, why? Why do you have to?
Yeah.
We love you to death. You're a big part of the team. We enjoy having the camaraderie in here. You don't have to fight. People put a lot of pressure on themselves.
Yeah.
And unless it's your sole income, there's not a lot of motivation. And even if it is your sole income, it's an investment into the future. You shouldn't expect to retire from fighting. You should fight, make good money with it, but you need to invest in it. You need to open a gym. You need to make investments. You need to do something. We hear a lot of real estate investors are in MMA. Do something with that. We try to help our students, our fighters, become better people, not just better fighters. We say when you're done with fighting, or maybe it doesn't take off, we still want you to have these career paths. And as a coach, I think that's responsible. If we told everybody to drop out of school, not have a job, and just come in here and train all day, so we get better. but a lot of people just aren't going to be very happy in 5 years.
No, they're
So
going
we try to be responsible with the young people that we coach, just in general.
So having seen the different personalities in their time doing this, all the ones coming up, what kind of advice would you give to the young fighters coming in? Because, I mean, you've seen the ones that have come in from I'm starting this out to they take their first amateur, they do their regional pros, to they get the call up to the UFC and all that. What do you look for in that, as far as like what potentials do you see with people versus others, and also what advice do you give them?
Like, the potential is a funny question, and I love talking about that. Obviously, if you came from an athletic background, that's a big potential. But we have just as many non-athletes, and you see that all the time in MMA. Non-athletes become these world champions. So there's not a cookie cutter perfect fighter that comes in. It really is a long-term investment, and we're honest about that. People say, I want to start fighting. Technically, I can get you a fight next week.
Yeah.
If I didn't care about you, or I just wanted you to get knocked out, or I wanted to be a cool coach and just like be in a corner again. We see that sometimes, and that's pretty rough.
Yeah.
We tell people, you have to train for a while. After you train for a while, we'll invite you to the MMA team. After you train with the MMA team for a while, we'll try to get you an amateur fight. Then you have to have 5 amateur fights minimum in Florida to go professional. And that blows people's minds. They're like, well, how quick would that be? Like a few months? I'm like, man, that's going to be a couple years.
Yeah, you do not grasp the concept, right?
And we're very honest about that with people.
Yeah.
That's not for everybody. Some people want to fight right now, and they'll go somewhere else and maybe fight, and usually doesn't end up well. But we're honest with it that this is a few-year investment at the very minimum. You know, then by that time, that's when you're professional. And then you make your professional debut and you make a few extra bucks. You know, you make a car payment. You don't retire on it. And a lot of people are blown away by that you have to work now harder because you're now at the professional level and everything counts. Anybody who is an athlete or came up through sports, we try to explain it. It's like the difference of Pop Warner or Little League. And then you get into junior varsity. Then you get into varsity. Now you have to go to college.
Yep.
Before you ever make a penny, where there's no other sport where people will walk in to the Orlando Magic and say, you know what, I've never played basketball, but I want to start because I'm really good at it. They would laugh you out and they'd kick you out. My dad taught me how to play basketball. Yeah. You know, get out of here. Where this sport, people will come in, I'm very tough. I've fought all my life in the streets. And I'm sure they are. You know, they're probably really good street fighters, but it's a completely different thing. We tell them, you have to start out. You have to start out of that Pop Warner before we work you up into junior varsity, into college, and then pro. And then there's levels of pro.
Yeah.
And people, I think that kind of, when we educate people with that, we're very honest with it. Those who stay with the program do very well. But I think we're flat out honest with people. And some people would say, it's not for me, change my mind. And I'd rather somebody change their mind now than be like heavily invested in this, get head trauma because they didn't take something serious.
Right.
And we're, with that, if somebody has a good work ethic, I think that really helps them with it. If you lose your fights and you come back on Monday and you start training, that means more than just having 3 easy fights sometimes about that individual's future. We'll say, you know, that person's dedicated, they're coachable, they'll ask after the fight, what could I have done better? How could I have blocked that or got out of that? And that really shows that they are vested into this. Like that, I think they'll be more successful than somebody who just disappears or misses weight and we never see again. You know, some people love to be a fighter, but they hate training like a fighter or being a fighter.
Yeah.
Everybody wants that glory in the cage and they've seen too many movies, but they don't know the back that you put into it.
Yeah. It's also just a very big disconnect with the general public on what the reality of the sport is. It's kind of why one of the reasons I do this podcast is I wanted to show that background and this side of things. But like, man, I've genuinely had a guy come in and wasted 10 minutes talking to him before he asked me how much I was going to pay him to train there. You know,
we haven't had that. That's pretty good.
Yeah. That was an awkward, dumbfounded few seconds of like, wait, what? Yeah, it's good to keep that reality with people as they come in. So we're getting kind of close to our 30-minute mark here. So what I kind of like to do around this point, anyone who's been in this sport for any amount of time, let alone as long as you have, has come across like that standout story, that like, what the hell was that kind of thing at the end of the time when you walk away from it. Doesn't have to be from being a coach, can be back when you were fighting, can be when you were a coach, whenever, but just something that really stands out in your mind. What would be that 1 or 2 stories that really jumps at you?
I think 2 good stories that are pretty funny. Just the old days of matchmaking, you asked about it. I was fighting in New Orleans and my opponent dropped out. So the night before, the promoter / matchmaker said, Mike, we found you a good replacement. He's a karate black belt. He's a little bit bigger than you, but I think you're going to be okay with it's his debut. You're going to smoke this guy. Sorry for the replacement. I said, sure. Now, there was no internet handy back then. There wasn't a lot of backgrounds. He was true. He was a karate black belt. He was also close to 200 pounds, an Army wrestler, Ranger, and a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu blue belt at the time. So he beat me from one side of the cage to the other for about 3 rounds. And I show a lot of my friends and students the video because everyone wants to show their highlight. I have no shame in showing my low lights also. But that was the luck of the draw back then. As I walked out, I felt pretty cool. I took off my gear and I'm staring at my corner. And I see my corner's eyes do this as this monster Terminator walked out and just ragdolled me for the next 15 minutes. And it was great. And those were the old days. It's just like, well, let's try our best. And there was hair pulling back then. And there was face stomps and everything else. And we became good friends afterwards. We actually trained together and I worked his corner for a couple of his fights. But at that time, you didn't know what you're getting into and you just go back and do it again because you loved it. Another time that I realized that there's a goofy group in here. We were all backstage talking before we went out and fought. And this was in Jacksonville. It was an old show called Battle Jacks, which was like one of the staples in Florida in the early thousands. And everybody looked pretty normal. As one person was warming up in particular, he was kind of off into the corner. And then right when they called his name, we knew it was weird. He had black contact lenses out there and then pulled on a pair of almost like leather fight shorts. And this guy was a heavy S&M bondage person who wanted to get beat up as bad as possible.
Whoa.
So he went out there, changed levels and put his chin out. And the other person didn't take the bait. He jumped back because he wasn't sure what was happening. And after 4 or 5 seconds, he realized this guy just wants to get knocked real hard. So he soccer kicked him because that was legal back then, across the cage. And the guy got up, ate a few more punches. It was just afterwards was so happy. And he walked in the back room with this grin.
Oh, creepy.
And then him and all of his other friends into the same thing. Where in the meantime, all of us teenage young guys that thought we were pretty tough were scared to death more of this odd bondage person taking a whooping and asking when the next time he could fight because it was so much fun it would be.
We realized back then I'd be creeped out.
The older I get, the more creepy it is too. So. Yeah. But that was back then too, because the promoters didn't know who you were. If you came in, you looked very normal. They said, yeah, buddy, we'll let you fight. There was no background. There was no where do you train or how long you've trained. And that was a good story that somewhere floating around on a VHS tape somewhere that I would love to find one day.
That's a good one.
It's hard to believe.
Yeah. I was amazed enough that they let him fight with black contacts.
Nobody knew back then.
But that's creepy. I do have one last question. I meant to bring this up before the stories, but so you were cornering Seth for the Kimbo fight, correct?
I was.
Yeah, you were there for all that. My question is, were there weirdness after that? Because Kimbo's fans were different. Yeah. There were some crazy people in that. Did you get any kind of backlash from that here at the Jungle? And
not so much backlash. Seth was scheduled to fight earlier on the card that night. His opponent switched up, and I think that was the night Ken Shamrock pulled out. Yeah. So the owners of the show approached us and said, hey, we need a heavyweight. Would Seth want to fight Kimbo in an hour? So we tried to play it cool. We're like, let us talk about this. And then they shut the door, and we were jumping up and down. Yes, we're going to be Kimbo. And we were pretty excited about it, but we had to play it ice cold for a minute. Later that night, Seth knocked him out. I think it was like 8 seconds with the 1 foot down Superman punch, flurry knockouts. That was not the plans of the owners. The funniest videos, everybody in the crowd were Kimbo fans, and there was a lot of death threats. There was a lot of threats in general. Kimbo was the nicest human being ever to walk. He was a great guy. In the press conference, he told everybody to be quiet. You're embarrassing me. He knocked me out fair and square. I would advise don't go on to the west side of town tonight because that's my after party and you won't go over there. Yeah. We took Kimbo's advice and we went somewhere else for the after party that night. But yeah, we didn't get backlash here necessarily. He got a lot of fans from it, where it was great. But the threats on our lives, on family members and everything that night was pretty scary. I think I picked Seth up on my shoulders and was walking around a cage and celebrating. And you could see guns being pulled, threatening as different things. And security told us to stop celebrating. Things are getting too real. A lot of police on and off duty offered us to hang out that night. They're like, hey, if we can come to your party, we will.
I'd have taken them up on it.
We took them all up on it, and we had a great time that night. So
Nice.
Yes, the Kimbo time was a wild night, but it went the way we thought we would do with Kimbo, just about a minute quicker than we were expecting. So.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you sitting down and doing this interview. Social medias and things like that you want to?
Yeah, you can find us on Instagram, on pretty much any social media, under the Jungle MMA. You'll see it. We have 2 locations, so the Jungle MMA and the Jungle MMA Lake Mary. And we're looking for a third right now, too. So maybe we'll have a third hashtag for you soon.
Awesome. Well, everyone, thank you for sitting down with us. And as always, follow us at Under the Cage, YouTube, Apple Music, Spotify, all that good stuff. And we will see you guys for the next interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate it.
All right. Good stuff. Good stuff.
What up, guys?
None of it recorded.